Shalom, everyone. Welcome back after our break. We are in Samuel Aleph, that is First Samuel. We are in chapter 4. Last message, last chapter, we talked about how Eli and his, basically, he had sinned the sin of omission. That is to say, that his sons had turned against the teachings that had been handed down from Moshe. They had been doing corrupt things instead of honorable and holy things. They were not living a sanctified life. Shemuel was ministering before Yehovah, doing the things that Eli was teaching him, and he had taken to sleeping in the sanctuary. He hears a voice in the night calling to him. He thinks it's Eli. He runs. Eli, I believe it was 3 times. Eli told him, I didn't call you. And the third time, I think it was, he told him, he realized that it was Yehovah calling to him. And he told him, go back, and if you hear the voice again, say, here I am. Servant hears. And so he did. And Yehovah told him that he had called him to be a prophet. And his first prophecy was going to be to tell Eli that the curses of Yehovah had come upon him and his household, just as he had told Eli would happen, but with more specifics. Okay? Today we're in chapter 4. It says, so the word of Shemuel came to all Israel. Okay? So he had told Eli this. Eli said, what's done is done. It's his will. I can't change it. And so some time now has passed. The word that he spoke, not necessarily, I don't know if it was just the word, we're not told if it's just the word about what's going to happen to Eli and his sons. It could have been, or it could have been other things that were told to him, because we don't know how much time has passed. It doesn't say. It says, Yisrael went out to fight against the Philistine, setting up camp at Even Azar, while the Philistine camped at Aphek. Okay. Philistine. This is an important word for us to know. Today, in Eretz Yisrael, we are, unfortunately, sadly, at war with some of our distant cousins, known as Palestinians. And a lot of secular people refuse to call our land Eretz Yisrael, or the state of Israel, land of Israel. They insist upon calling it Palestine. And I recently put out a challenge. I showed a picture of a coin that was dug up in Eretz Israel. It is dated at, I want to say, 2,300 years old. And in Paleo Hebrew, not modern Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Torah, it says Israel. Okay, very plainly. If you know Paleo Hebrew, you can't help but see it stand out on the coin. And so I put out the challenge, and I said, I challenge anyone to show me anything in any language that's 2,300 years old that comes from that land, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world, that says Palestine. And they can't. No one has stepped up and said, oh, here it is. Here's this vase that says Palestine on it. No coins, nothing. And the reason I knew I could make that challenge and no one could answer it is because the word Palestine did not exist in that time period. The word Palestine didn't exist until the first century AD, first century of the Common Era, I guess I should say. And it was a Roman invention, and it was put on the land, Eretz Israel, it was put on our land by the Romans to demoralize us. They took the name of an ancient enemy of Israel, the Philistine. They put their own Roman twist on it and called the land Palestine. Okay? There was never a kingdom called Palestine. There was never a king or queen or president or prime minister or governor or anything of Palestine, unless you count the Roman governors. But they were Roman governors. They were governors from Rome over this captured land. And the term Palestine comes from Philistine. But do you know what Philistine means? And hence what Palestine means? I've seen several different translations from the Paleo-Hebrew. The Paleo-Hebrew pictograph seems to imply that a Philistine is someone who's homeless, a wanderer, a sojourner, but not a sojourner among us, a sojourner despite us. Which is interesting because what does it mean today to be a Palestinian? There's no true Palestinian government. They have what they call the Palestinian Authority, which is basically just a bunch of thugs, warlords, whatever, who got together and they each control a piece of so-called Palestine. And that's the government, if you really want to get down to it. And in order to be a Palestinian, by definition, during the Great Diaspora, we're still in diaspora, but before 1948, when we started going home en masse, when the United Nations said, you know what, you deserve as a people to have your homeland back, go, do what you can do with it. And we went in, and there was nothing there but desert. There were no paved roads. There was no running water. There was no electricity anywhere. It was just a bunch of homeless, vagabond drifters keeping goats and sheep. And that's all they've done. And we went in there and we built up cities with roads and highways in between them and electricity and running water. And we literally turned the Dead Sea into a source of clean, drinkable water by developing the technology. We're the first people in the world to develop the technology to do that. Now we've developed a way to take the desert air and turn it into water. Nobody thought it could be done. We've done it. And if you fly over the Middle East and you look down, you see sand, 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 green spot, sand, sand, sand. That green spot that looks like an emerald in the sand is Eretz Israel. Not the whole of Eretz Israel, but the part of Eretz Israel that we control as a people. And as soon as you step over the border into the Palestinian area, it goes back to being sand. Okay? We have been blessed for going home. But to be a Palestinian, by definition, is that when we were in that great diaspora and almost no Jewish people lived in the land, there were still some of us there, but almost no of the Israelis lived in the land. The land was under the control from time to time. Different groups, different empires controlled it. The last empire to control it was the British Empire. They didn't really know what to call it. They looked through ancient records and they said, well, the Romans called it Palestine, so they called it their Palestinian protectorate, basically. Okay? But the people who lived there, if you read the records, the people who lived there were basically this. If you or your ancestors got kicked out of basically every legitimate Arab state in the region and had no place else to go, you could go to this place called Palestine, where there was no government. If you got kicked out of every legitimate country, it's probably because you were a criminal. Okay, because if you're just a political outsider, you just go to another country that's more accepting to your politics, right? But if you get kicked out of every surrounding country and you end up in this dust bowl, and they say, okay, now you're a Palestinian because you live in Palestine. That's what it is to be a Palestinian. Why am I saying all of this? Because we're getting ready to see what I would say is the closest thing we have to a cultural and spiritual ancestor to today's Palestinians is exactly where they got their name, the Philistine. The Philistine drew up in battle formation against Israel. The battle was fierce, and Israel was beaten by the Philistine. Uh-oh. They killed about 4,000 soldiers on the battlefield. When the army had returned to camp, the leaders of Israel asked, why has Yehovah defeated us today before the Philistine? You notice what they said? They said, there's no way that we should have lost this war, this battle. This wasn't the whole war, it was just the battle that day. There's no way we should have lost this battle. Everything was on our side. We had the better leadership. We had the technology. It's our land. So the only way we could have lost this would be if Yehovah was not with us. So what have we done wrong? Let's bring the ark for the covenant of Yehovah from Shiloh to us, so that he will come among us and save us from our enemies. Interestingly, is my understanding, just from my studies, that the root word for save us here is also the root word for sanctify us, set us apart. Let's bring the covenant ark here so that he'll be with us and separate us from them. You know what? He was going to do that. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark for the covenant of Yehovah Zavot, who is present above the Keruvim. Okay, so they were calling for the presence, literally, of Yehovah as he sits and he dwells between the wings of the cherubim, the cherubim, above what is commonly miscalled the mercy seat. The two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark for the covenant of Elohim. You notice who was not there? Eli was not there, and Shemuel was not there. Eli was not there because he's old and blind. But you know what? He could have asked to be carried down there. Did he try to go and stop his sons? No. And I think it goes back to why. I think it goes back to what he said in the previous chapter. You know what it is Yehovah's going to do what he's going to do. Why was Shemuel not there? Shemuel was not there because it was not the will of Yehovah that his ark of his covenant be taken and shown off and used like a weapon. When the ark for the covenant of Yehovah entered the camp, all Yisrael gave a mighty shout that resounded through the land. On hearing the shout, the Philistine asked, "What does this great shout in the Hebrews' camp mean?" Then they realized that the ark of Yehovah had arrived in the camp, and the Philistine became afraid. They knew what they were dealing with. They'd heard the stories. They said, "Elohim has entered the camp. We're lost." You hear that? They did not call him Yehovah because they didn't have a personal relationship with him. And so, as I said in the earlier session, we need to be calling upon him by his name, Yehovah. We need to also not cheapen that. If a Gentile wants to call him Elohim and begin to recognize his power and his authority in their lives, that's great. The Yehovah is the name that his covenantal children call him by. We who are his firstborn son call him by, and that's a reference to the earlier teaching on what he actually said to Moshe at the burning bush. If you're listening at home and you don't understand the firstborn son reference, go back and look in the Exodus 4 or listen to the Exodus 4 teaching, and you'll understand that. They did not call him Yehovah because they did not have that intimate relationship, and yet they knew what it could mean that his ark was present. There was no such thing yesterday or the day before. In other words, they've never just carried it into battle in this manner. Oh, they've carried it before them. We know what it can do, but they've never brought it in down from the temple into the war camp. We're lost. Who will rescue us from the power of these mighty Elohim? These are the Elohim that completely overthrew the Mitzrayim in the desert. Be strong and behave like men, you Philistine, so that you won't become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Behave like men and fight. You know how I say nothing happens by accident? And how the teachings, I don't plan that, oh, well, we're going to do this chapter and this chapter together, and because they teach the same thing. Okay, and in the earlier message, as I meant to touch on this, but in the earlier message I said, isn't it interesting, we missed a week because of technical difficulties. And yet in that week passage, my sister-in-law, who did not know that I was preparing to teach on that subject, came and asked me about that specific, not just that subject, but that passage. Had no idea where we were in this study. Well, now I'm asking you to look at that, but also look at the use of the term Elohim. Now, in the previous teaching, the Exodus 4 teaching that we did earlier in the afternoon, there was a clear depiction or distinction of the use of the word Elohim, not for Abba on the throne. And I said there are several places where it's, seems clear to me, and there are a few places, a handful of places where it's absolutely, undeniably clear that the word is not referring to him. And that draws and points to the fact we need to be specific in our study of the context. Listen again to what's said. Who will rescue us from the power of these mighty Elohim? They're not talking about Abba. They're not talking about Hashem. They're not talking about El Shaddai. They're talking about these warriors. These are the Elohim that completely overthrew the Mitzrayim in the desert. Were these literally the same warriors? No. They were their descendants. But they were serving the same Elohim. The Philistine fought Yisrael. The Philistine fought, Yisrael was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. It was a terrible slaughter. 30,000 of Yisrael's foot soldiers fell. Moreover, the ark of Elohim was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. How could that be? They stopped fighting in their flesh. They went back. They brought the ark down to let Elohim, to let Yehovah do their battle for them. What they should have been doing in the first place. Not taking the ark down, but letting him fight the battle. How is it that another 30,000 of them were killed? How is it that the battle turned against them and two priests died? I'll tell you how. It's because, as we read in the previous chapter, never did a word of prophecy come from the mouth of Shemuel and fall to the ground. Every prophetic word he ever spoke was fulfilled and honored, beginning with his first prophecy of what was going to happen to Eli and his sons. One of the soldiers, a man from Benjamin, ran and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and earth on his head. And this translation puts in brackets as a sign of mourning. That's actually a redactical statement. It was added into some text later on. It is not in the oldest texts. I don't think it's actually in the majority text. I could be wrong, but I know it's not in the oldest one. So that's actually, if you're following along in the Complete Jewish Study Bible, that's why the brackets are there. It says, and as he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, watching because he was trembling with anxiety over the ark of Elohim. When the man entered the city and told the news, the whole city began crying out. On hearing the cries, Eli asked, what does this uproar mean? So the man hurried, came to Eli and told him. Eli was 98 years old, and his gaze was fixed because he was blind. So many people, skeptics especially, will read this and say, this makes no sense. Previous chapter says he's grown blind. This one says he was watching with anxiety. Now it turns around and says he's blind. Which one's the truth? Obviously, you can't believe the Bible. Can't believe the Torah, or this would be Tanakh. Let me tell you something. I have some blind folks in my family. We have a disease that runs in our family. It's a genetic disorder called macular degeneration. My mother is pretty much blind. Her father was blind. I have had great aunts and great uncles who've gone blind. And there is a period of time wherein They are blind, and yet they can see. They will not see your face, but they will see the outline of your silhouette. Okay, my grandfather, to the day he died, could see and tell who I was when I walked in the room. If he could see my silhouette against a window or an open door or something, he knew who I was because of the shape of my body and how I stand before I even spoke. Okay, not everyone who is blind is completely blind, but there comes a point where your blindness is such that you become more and more helpless. Okay, now I'm not saying that he necessarily had macular degeneration. Okay, although it does tend to run, from what I've read, in Ashkenazim, which we are, but that would mean that the genetic tendency had to be back there someplace before there were Ashkenazim Jews. Okay, back somewhere back in the Middle East is where that our genetics begin there. Um, the man said to Eli, "I am a soldier that came. I escaped today from the battlefield." He asked, "How did things go, my son?" The one who had come with the news answered, "Yisrael fled before the Philistine, and there was a terrible slaughter among the people. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, also are dead, and the ark of Elohim was captured." As soon as he mentioned what had happened to the ark of Elohim, Eli fell backward off his seat next to the gate, broke his neck, and died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. Did anyone notice a switch here in how they refer to the ark? Earlier, it was the ark of the covenant of Yehovah. Now, it is the ark of Elohim. Why does it change? Nothing in this text is there just because it's there. Everything in his word is there for a reason. I believe the reason we switch from seeing the ark of Yehovah's covenant to the ark of Elohim is because Eli and the people who were still living came to realize that what had happened because they had lost their intimate relationship with him, with the Creator. It never begins with one day all the people, all of B'nai Israel wakes up and we just decide we're not keeping the covenant today. It begins with the leadership. Even if it's the leadership allowing things that we shouldn't to enter into the congregation, it always begins with the leadership. Whether it's the eldership of a congregation teaching wrong, or whether it's the eldership of the community allowing certain things that they know are wrong and turning a blind eye like Eli did, it always begins with a decision at the top, so to speak. Eli lost his intimacy with Yehovah because he allowed his sons to do wrong without condemning the sin. His sons did not have that intimate relationship because they were allowed to do wrong instead of being made to do right. The people of Israel soon followed thereafter. And the ark of the covenant of Yehovah went out from our possession. His daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and near delivery time. When she heard the news that the ark of Elohim had been captured and that her father-in-law and husband were dead, she went into abnormal labor. Now, I looked that up, that abnormal labor And I think what we're talking about here is contractions that did not open the womb properly. Okay, part of the function of contractions is to open the birth canal. And the way I'm reading the Hebrew, I'm thinking it was probably that she could not pass the child and that she lost blood in the process. Bent over and gave birth, um, which indicates that eventually the birth canal was opened. But it says, as she was dying, the women standing by her said to her, don't be afraid, because you have given birth to a son. But she didn't answer or show any sign of recognition. She named the child Ichava. Literally, that means without glory, saying, the glory has departed from Yisrael because the ark of Elohim has been captured, and because her father-in-law and husband, or because of her father-in-law and husband. She said, the glory of Yisrael has gone into exile because the ark of Elohim has been captured. There is no glory because the ark of Elohim has been captured. Where is the ark of Elohim today? I think I know. I think it's underneath the ground in a grotto in Eretz Yisrael that the government will not allow to be excavated. I think it's because they know it's there too. If you ever want a teaching on why I think that's it, obviously that's not a dogmatic teaching. It would be a more of a talk about the archaeological things that point to that. I'd be glad to do that. But I think there's a reason why, and despite what the mainline churches will tell you, the reason we've never had the Ark of the Covenant back is because um, that's the old covenant. It was done away with, and we have a new covenant. Um, Scripture does not teach that. Scripture teaches that certain of the most precious things of the faith were hidden just prior to the Babylonian captivity, and Jewish tradition teaches that this is extra biblical, but it's been handed down by the Rabbim for generation after generation after generation, say that the prophet Jeremiah actually took the Ark of the Covenant and hid it, and that it will be revealed to the people and to the Kohanim, when the time comes that we are able to rebuild the temple. Um, I I know they make a big deal out of it. They say, well, and when Messiah died, the the veil was torn over the Holy of Holies, and there was the ark wasn't there. They knew the ark wasn't there, folks. The ark hadn't been there since before the previous temple was destroyed. It was hidden. Okay, and they rebuilt the temple, but they never put the ark back in the place. Um, I think it could be that for a long time they didn't know where it was, or they may have just left it there and said we're not going to put it back in its place because being human beings, they may have been like, you know what, this us being in charge is pretty cool. We put the ark back in its place, then Elohim's in charge. Yehovah's rule govern. I have a number of theories on that, um, but I want you to consider the fact that we're still living in a time where, although we'll read later on about how they got the ark back, but we're currently living in a time when you could just as easily say that the ark has been carried away. And although I believe the Jewish people have possession of it, it's not where it should be. We're still in a diaspora. We're still in a captivity, if you want to think about it that way. Our neighbors aren't Jewish, and the Jewish people are not all returning home. The question then would be why? And the answer to that question is because we as a people, remember how I talked about the priests were to be priests to us and we were to be priests to the world. And when, I firmly believe this, when his people behave like his son, when we are living our lives as he calls us to do, when all of B'nai Yisrael is keeping the Shabbat and the Moedim and Kashrut and everything else that we're supposed to do, every other mitzvah that we're supposed to do, I believe that will usher in the time when we will have the ark back, when we will have a temple again. We have a midrash.